So continuing my series on Uranus, this is Uranus in the the 5th and the 11th houses. Uranus in the 11th house. The 11th house relates to Aquarius, which some astrologers, myself included, have Uranus firmly in control of. Some people think that Saturn rules Aquarius. I think that Uranus rules Aquarius. Uranus in the 11th house. In a negative sense, Uranus in the 11th house is very much the isolationist, the individual anarchist who bestows, who ignores the needs of community, who chooses not to have active friends, and whose associates and community, if you like, are all a bunch of people who are relatively isolationist, individualist, borderline extremist, not necessarily in a negative way, but all people who espouse community and feel that they're much stronger alone. Uranus in a difficult position in the 11th house is someone who would rather do it on their own than depend on other people for help. And at the same time, it's someone who may find the limitations and structures of a community as being somewhat limiting or boring. Uranus in a neutral position in the 11th house is quite ambivalent towards the global community and can well work in a way that does bring benefit into the lives of those less fortunate than oneself, but it also brings an attitude towards community which is very much like a kind of cold and sterile family. It's almost as if people with a neutral Uranus in the 11th house do things for the benefit of their friends and community, not because they want praise or recognition, but because it's just the right thing to do. They don't even see it as something that's worthy of praise. They just do it because it's right. Uranus in a positive way in the 11th house has very unusual friends. People with Uranus in the 11th, I say to them that none of your friends are normal. They're all different. They're all stimulating and innovative and futuristic. And a positively aspected Uranus is someone who will constantly bring innovation, novelty and stimulus into their community and derive those same things from their community. A retrograde Uranus in the 11th house is someone whom over the course of their life will go through a number of different changes in their attitudes towards group, friend, humanity and community, and will find that as they get older, their real friends are very much more eclectic and widely spread all around the world, and sometimes they don't see them for years, but they're still good friends. The 5th house, relating to the 5th sign of Leo, is opposite the 11th, and it's where Uranus is traditionally most uncomfortable. The 5th house relates to creativity, and the most common example of creativity is procreativity, hence children. So a difficult Uranus in the 11th house is going to bring a lot of these people are going to find that their relationships with children and their creative output is always going to be somewhat spontaneous, sporadic, unpredictable and potentially disruptive. These are the people who can grow up separate from their children or who as children may have had dictatorial, tyrannical childhoods, not necessarily abusive, but just very, very hard work. A difficult Uranus in the 5th house will occasionally create pure moments of magical, spontaneous genius, but the angst and the pain that it takes to force that out of the individual sometimes means it's really not worth it. A neutral Uranus in the 5th house is someone who could easily make a Steiner school or a Montessori teacher. It's someone who has an unusual and more futuristic attitude towards education, towards child raising, and towards the creative potential. These are the people with a neutral Uranus who are always looking at the new development pages on the websites and saying, well, what's coming around the corner? They're quite futuristic. It's quite a healthy position. And a positive Uranus in the 5th house gives such an ability. It is the creative genius. It is the mad scientist to an extent, but it's also someone who has very stimulating, growthful and creative power, and this particularly comes through with areas around their children. These are the people who will encourage their children to become independent from an early age and who will say to the children, I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. You go and learn for yourself, but I've got a safety net for you. A retrograde Uranus in the 5th house can often produce people who have no children or difficulty in having children if they're female or rearing children if they're male. And it also kind of produces a kind of stunted or stulted blockage when it comes to expressing their creative ability. And the way to work through this is to not create externally, but to create internally. There you go, folks. Uranus in the 5th and the 11th. I'll do the remaining 4 houses over the coming few days.